Hello, and welcome to an introduction to the science of reading. This session is designed to provide you with an introductory understanding of the science of reading and how it applies to students with intellectual disabilities. We will explore the 5 essential components of reading and corresponding instructional practices designed to support reading development for individual students accessing an adapted curriculum. Here are the outcomes for today's session. Let's start by sorting some facts and myths about reading instruction for students with intellectual disabilities. I'll show a statement and ask you to think about whether the statement is a fact or a myth. Feel free to pause the video to give yourself some additional think time at any time during this training. Is this a fact or a myth? Students with intellectual disabilities should only receive functional life skills instruction. This is a myth. What is functional is different for each student. Students cannot effectively comprehend without decoding instruction, which gives them access to reading. Students with intellectual disabilities have historically had very limited access to comprehensive and research-based literacy instruction. This lack of access is due to previous beliefs that literacy instruction for this population needed to focus on functional vocabulary, so think sight word only instruction, and less on comprehensive literacy, including phonics-based instruction. The use and outcomes of comprehensive literacy instruction with students with intellectual disabilities have increasingly been researched in an attempt to provide the student population with more well-rounded and equitable literacy education, instead of continuing with the assumption that phonics-based reading, comprehension, and writing are unattainable for these students. Is this a fact or a myth? Students with significant cognitive disabilities are too impacted to learn to read. This is a myth. Skilled teachers with strong knowledge of how to support the varying intensive needs of this student population can effectively teach them to learn to read. Research leading to an understanding of how students with intellectual disabilities acquire knowledge and skills based on their various needs indicates that this is probably the least likely population of students to acquire literacy skills without access to explicit and carefully planned instruction, i.e., teachers who have been given the knowledge and tools needed to be able to effectively plan and execute instruction for these students. Is this one a fact or a myth? Students with intellectual disabilities should receive instruction in both decoding and comprehension. This one is a fact. Effective reading and writing instruction for any individual must be comprehensive. It is more than the sequential mastery of skills. Comprehensive instruction provides individuals with access to instruction each day that supports their ability to read words, phonemic awareness, phonics, and word identification, and read text with comprehension, fluency, vocabulary, and text comprehension. When individuals with intellectual disabilities are provided with access to comprehensive instruction, they can develop conventional reading and writing skills. Is this a fact or a myth? Learning sight words is the most important skill for this population of students. This one is a myth. Although some students have been successful in learning to read to a degree with this approach, so by memorization, problems arise as students attempt to read more challenging texts. As difficulty increases, complicated, unique, and multisyllabic words become more common, and one needs a reliable decoding strategy to know how to read unknown words. We cannot expect children to simply memorize every word they may one day encounter, or we run the risk of relegating them to a minimum level of reading ability. Once students have learned to decode, they will, in fact, begin to recognize many words by sight. Is this a fact or a myth? Students who are nonverbal or nonvocal can learn to read and decode. It is a fact. The opportunity to learn to read and write should be afforded to all, regardless of spoken communication ability. Perhaps most importantly, the ability to spell, even at very beginning levels, gives individuals with severe communication impairments the ability to communicate anything they want. You've probably heard the terms decoding and encoding. Decoding happens when we turn print to speech, essentially reading. Encoding happens when we turn print when we turn speech to print, essentially spelling. These skills go hand in hand. Let's look at another one. Is this a fact or a myth? Students are not demonstrating reading comprehension, but rather their listening comprehension abilities by answering WH questions after a text is read to them. This is a fact. After listening to a book, students have not actively engaged in the act of reading and decoding words. Is this a fact or a myth? Secondary students with intellectual disabilities are too old to learn how to read. This is a myth. Emergent literacy begins at birth. It is not restricted by age or disability and develops as a result of opportunity and experience. Many of our students have not been given either, so we have to teach it. Is this a fact or a myth? Students with intellectual disabilities at the secondary level would benefit from being enrolled in a literacy essentials class and a foundations of English class at the same time. This is a fact. A literacy essentials class is where reading instruction should take place. Foundations of English is where English instruction should take place. Ideally, students will receive the opportunity to participate in a Foundations of English core class, along with a Literacy Essentials elective course. So let's talk about reading instruction for students with intellectual disabilities. The first step in helping a child with an intellectual disability to become literate is to presume competence in his or her abilities to gain such knowledge and skills. This means to put aside doubts and preconceived notions about what a student may be able to accomplish based on a student's level of disability, estimates of IQ, or assumed limitations, and instead teach as if the child will learn. Put another way, to presume competence in students is to believe that all individuals can acquire valued skills if given appropriate structures and supports. This includes exposure to all forms of literacy and access to educators who are informed about reading instruction. This slide lists difficulties that many of our students experience when learning to read. Students who have speech or articulation delays, students who have difficulty manipulating sounds, students who struggle to blend sounds together or break words apart, and students who have difficulty learning letter names and sounds will most likely find reading challenging. Students who have difficulties in the areas above will experience difficulties comprehending text, which is the ultimate purpose of learning to read. Without research-based intervention, struggling students will face cascading consequences. So, what is the science of reading? About 25 years ago, Congress created a national reading panel with the aim of assessing the effectiveness of different approaches used to teach children to read. The experts in reading research and reading instruction who comprised the panel looked at reading studies that were conducted in accordance with rigorous research protocols. In the year 2000, the National Reading Panel published its influential report on effective reading instruction. That report gave confidence to a scientific approach to measuring and understanding reading instruction. Since the year 2000, scientists and linguists have produced even more data on how children learn to read. We know we need to provide systematic and explicit phonics instruction. Good reading also depends on accurate reading of printed words, sufficient reading speed, or fluency, and comprehension of the meaning of words, sentences, and paragraphs. The ultimate goal that we have for our students is to be able to read, interact, and connect with text. In 1986, two researchers created the concept of the simple view of reading. As the model on the slide shows, reading comprehension, which is the ultimate goal of reading, is the product of decoding and language comprehension. This is another more complex view of reading. While showing the two major aspects of reading, language comprehension and word recognition, this graphic emphasizes how intertwined they become during skilled reading. Language comprehension consists of background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge, while word recognition is built from phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. Each strand of reading should be taught, as it is through this instruction, that readers can learn to apply language comprehension skills while also becoming more automatic in recognizing words. Evidence-based practices can make all the difference for our students. Research in brain images show increased magnetic activity in a child's brain after systematic, intensive, and explicit decoding instruction. This increased brain activity was paired with significant gains in word recognition and decoding. It has also been found that intensive instruction in decoding and rapid word recognition make the brains of some young students with severe reading disabilities function more like the brains of typical readers and significantly improve reading ability. With targeted interventions, children's brains have the capacity to change in as little time as a year. That being said, we know that students with intellectual disabilities require even more repetition and prolonged instruction in a skill in order to make progress. One long-term study showed that after 1 to 1.5 years of consistent instruction in a comprehensive reading program, about half of the students went from being non-readers to being able to demonstrate phonemic awareness skills, such as identifying the sound for individual letters within 3 to 4 letter words and blending them together to read the words made up of those letters. They were also able to demonstrate comprehension skills, such as retelling stories, sequencing main events, and identifying story elements. Generally, students in this study took about twice the amount of time to successfully complete lessons than struggling readers in previous studies. Phonemic awareness and phonics skills assessments also revealed that gains were typically not evident until students had been participating in the intervention for approximately 15 to 20 weeks of instruction. So the time required to measure achievement gain was much longer in duration than is typical of struggling readers without intellectual disabilities. Therefore, while the content of instruction for students with and without intellectual disabilities is the same, what makes them different is the consistency needed on the part of the schools to provide this instruction. This means we cannot just try something for a few weeks and then move on if we're not seeing immediate results. Now that we've reviewed the scientific research on how we read, we will turn to the 5 essential components of effective reading instruction as determined by the National Reading Panel. The panel published a report in the year 2000, and its findings are still relevant. Beginning readers need each piece of this puzzle to learn how to read and comprehend. Notice that this graphic puts comprehension at the center because that is the end goal of reading. The first of the 5 essential components of effective reading instruction is phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is the understanding that spoken words are made up of individual sounds, which are called phonemes. Students who have strong phonemic awareness are able to identify and manipulate phonemes in spoken words. It is important to emphasize the term spoken words, as this skill is auditory. It gives students a way to approach sounding out new words and primes them for print. A student's skill in phonemic awareness is a very good predictor of future reading ability. So, what does science say about phoneme awareness? Phonemes are the 44 smallest and most distinct units of speech in the English language. For example, the word cat has 3 phonemes. A, t. The word chop also has 3 phonemes. Ch, a. Phonemic awareness is the ability for students to say or identify the individual sounds and words, pull them apart, and put them together, which eventually enables those skills necessary for reading and spelling. Students have to master basic and advanced phonemic awareness in order to grasp letter sounds later on. Basic phonemic awareness includes blending. For example, I can blend the individual phonemes sh, to say the word ship. Basic phoneme awareness also includes segmentation, which is splitting words into their individual phonemes, such as dividing the word teach into individual phonemes, t, e, ch. Advanced phonemic awareness skills include phoneme deletion, substitution, and reversal. The good news is that at any age, we can teach this concept. After a review of the scientific research, the National Reading Panel concluded that teaching students to manipulate sounds and language helps them to read. The most effective phonemic awareness instruction is blending and segmenting. Blending sounds to form words is closely related to reading. Segmenting the words into individual sounds is closely related to spelling. Students who are weak in phonemic awareness will benefit the most from the systematic strengthening of skills that are most closely related to understanding how letters represent spoken language. Here we can see an example of how to teach students the skill of blending. The teacher or parent would provide the student with individual phonemes, and the expectation would be for the student to blend them together to say or select the correct word. For example, the parent or teacher says, b, a, t. Teacher asks, what word did I say? Student identifies, bat. For students who are nonverbal or have limited verbal communication, the use of a field to choose from would support the student's ability to demonstrate their understanding receptively by pointing, touching, eye gazing, or whatever method of communication they use. This could be using word cards on a device, computer screen, whiteboard, or other convenient method. Here is an example of segmenting. The idea would be for the teacher or parent to say a word before stretching it out. This way, students can hear the word as it is spoken, as well as have the opportunity to identify the various phonemes the word is comprised of. In this example, students are being asked to identify the initial sound. For example, the teacher says, dog. What sound does dog start with? Student identifies D. As students acquire additional skills and understanding, you can remove the scaffold included where the word is stretched out by simply just saying the word dog, as well as asking them to identify other sounds found in various parts of the spoken word. There are many more activities and strategies that provide explicit multisensory instruction for phonemic awareness. One activity, Sound Buckets, comes from the University of Florida Literacy Institute. For this activity, students would determine how many phonemes are in a word and place them in the correct bucket. You would follow the I do, we do, you do model for this activity. You can do this on a smartboard, a touchscreen computer, a file folder, or work mat with pictures, or you could use real objects and containers from around your home or classroom. There are so many variations of this activity you could do with your students, including starting with sorting by number of syllables, the first sounds in words, the last sounds in words, or starting with just 2 buckets and working your way up to more. Another great phonemic awareness activity that can be used in any setting are Elkonin Boxes. Elkonin Boxes are an instructional method that can be used to help children with reading difficulties build phonemic awareness by segmenting words into individual sounds. They are named after D.B. Elkonin, the Russian psychologist who developed the concept. For this activity, students push a counter into a box for each sound they hear. As the teacher or parent, you will dictate a word. The student will repeat it back to you and then mark the boxes for the phonemes. The student should repeat the word again once they have marked the phonemes, which they can do verbally or using a communication device. Again, you can do this on a smartboard, touchscreen computer, or using a laminated sheet with boxes on it and bingo markers. Students with fine motor deficits could use their most consistent form of communication to participate in these activities. For example, they may blink their eyes or press a head switch for every sound they hear. Because this is an oral activity, students with visual impairments could participate by clapping or tapping for every sound they hear. You could include Velcro in each box, so they may Velcro the bingo marker in place. As an additional scaffold for students still working on concepts of print, you can consider adding an arrow to remind them that our printed language reads from left to right. Other ideas of how this activity could be modified or broken down even further include bringing it back to a more phonological awareness skill of segmenting syllables, breaking up compound words, identifying onset and rhyme, or even keeping it very focused to only one word family. Let's do this word together. Cat. K. A. T. Cat. Let's try a trickier one. I use the word shell this time because it can be tricky. Remember, each box corresponds to a sound, not a letter. So in the case of the word shell, there are 5 letters, but only 3 sounds. Now let's do this one together. Sh, o, shell. Now we will talk about another essential component of reading instruction, phonics. Phonics is a system of letters and letter combinations that represent speech sounds. It is the process of connecting the sounds in words to written letters. This is one of the earliest reading skills children should develop. Phonics skill development helps children understand the relationship between sounds of written letters, letter combinations, and words. Again, phonics is the relationship between letters and sounds. Phonics focuses on how sounds look in writing. Consequently, most phonics instruction is written, whereas most phonemic awareness instruction lessons are oral. While instruction of phonemic awareness and instruction phonics are 2 distinct components of effective reading instruction, the National Reading Panel noted overlap between them. Research shows that teaching students to manipulate phonemes, or speech sounds, with letters is more effective in terms of reading instruction than without letters, probably because teaching students to blend phonemes with letters is equivalent to decoding instruction. Take a moment to read what phonics instruction teaches our students. You may pause the video and resume it when you're ready. In order for phonics instruction to be successful for our students with reading deficits, it must be explicit and systematic. By explicit, I mean clearly and directly taught by an adult with modeling, guided practice, and independent practice, which includes immediate feedback and corrections. By systematic, I mean instruction that goes in a particular order, from the most basic letter sound instruction to more advanced skills. Without systematic instruction, students master basic skills before advancing to more complex skills, and teachers In order for phonics instruction to be successful for our students with reading deficits, it must be both explicit and systematic. By explicit, I mean clearly and directly taught by an adult with modeling, guided practice, and independent practice, which includes immediate feedback and corrections. By systematic, I mean instruction that goes in a particular order from the most basic letter sound instruction to more advanced skills. With systematic instruction, students master basic skills before advancing to more complex skills, and teachers only use texts that are decodable and based on the skills already taught. The National Reading Panel also stated that phonics instruction should be combined within a reading program that includes texts with controlled vocabulary and quality literature to develop students' vocabulary and comprehension. Before we look at some examples of explicit and systematic instruction, consider that 80% of English is decodable, meaning the words within the language follow predictable patterns that can be sounded out. Almost 50% of these words are closed syllables, which means the syllable is closed off by one or more consonants following a short vowel, such as the word cat. It's less important that you know about open and closed syllables, and more important that you understand that by teaching students letter sound correspondence, we are giving them the skills to read almost half of the words in our language. This means that a student who has the skills to decode the word cat also has the skills to decode the word fantastic, as it is 3 closed syllables within one word. This is powerful information and should definitely make you think twice before making the assumption that a student can only memorize a word rather than teaching them the fundamental literacy skills necessary to decode words. Now, let's take a look at some examples of phonics instruction that you can use to support students. Here's an example of a simple letter sound activity you can complete with your student using any materials you have on hand. The teacher or parent presents the student with a field or letter choices ranging from 2 to 4, depending on the student's abilities. The teacher or parent says a letter sound, and the student touches the letter that makes that sound. For example, the parent or teacher says, B. Teacher or parent then asks, what letter makes that sound? Student can then touch the letter B or says B. In addition to this simple activity, there are also a variety of websites that work on this basic sound of letter sound identification. This is an example of the letter sounds race phonics game. This phonics game requires a magnetic board, magnetic letters, and a lot of space. Set up the magnetic board on one side of a room and place the magnetic letters in a basket or bowl on the other side. The teacher or parent calls out a sound or word starting or ending in a particular sound, and then you will ask the student with a ready, set, go to pick out the correct magnetic letters and run over as fast as they can to stick it on the board. Additional adaptations for students include using larger letters or letter tiles, doing the activity on a cookie sheet where students can move letter into designated area on the sheet, and or reducing the size of the field instead of a larger basket or bowl filled with all the letters. Now we are going to move from phonemic awareness and phonics to fluency. How does fluency instruction set the stage for future reading success? Fluency is reading with sufficient accuracy, rate, and expression, which supports comprehension. If students read slowly and laboriously, they will use so much brain power on word recognition that they will have little left to derive meaning. The National Reading Panel found a close relationship between fluency and reading comprehension. Students need to be able to read text quickly, accurately, and with expression. Fluency should be regularly assessed in order to provide timely and effective instruction and intervention as needed. So, what types of fluency instruction is backed by science? For any student with or without disabilities, providing a model of fluent reading is important. Students must be given the opportunity to hear books and other texts read aloud by expert readers to begin to understand how fluent reading should sound. If a student's fluency rate is low, he or she may need more instruction in identifying words accurately and automatically. Therefore, interventions in decoding and recognition of irregularly spelled words would likely be beneficial. For students who have processing deficits, speech impairments, or for students who are nonverbal, communication devices or other assistive technology can be used to provide accommodations. It will be important to consider intelligibility for students who are able to physically produce sounds. You may talk to a student's speech and language pathologist to determine acceptable word and sound approximations so you know what you're listening for. A very basic activity you can incorporate into reading with your students is the convention of print. That is, that text is read from left to right and top to bottom. This also draws students' attention to the connection between spoken and written word. This is a great exercise for all students and an opportunity for students with limited verbal skills to demonstrate that one-to-one correspondence of word print. Repeated readings. When measuring a student's fluency, it is important to do so using passages that contain decodable words that the student has already learned. Fluency can be addressed through repeated readings of the same text, words, sentences, or longer passages. Overall, the value of predictable text and repeated storylines is that students often more rapidly make sense of them. They gain sensitivity to text structure, acquire vocabulary, and participate more readily and successfully in independent reading or interactions with others about the text. This is an example of a roll and read activity. This is an activity your students will roll a die and read the column of words based on the number their die lands on. Again, you will only include words the student has already learned to decode. Eventually, you could time a student's ability to read their column to see if their rate is increasing. Ways that you can modify this activity include taking out the die rolling component and just using word lists, playing beat the clock or timer for students who are motivated to read quickly, or breaking down the activity down to the letter or phoneme level. Let's move on to vocabulary. Now that we've explored phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency instruction, we are ready for the fourth essential component of effective reading instruction, our vocabulary. Vocabulary instruction is needed for students to comprehend. Recent research suggests that teaching students with intellectual disabilities strategies to monitor their own comprehension can be helpful. One way to achieve this is to do frequent think alouds when reading aloud to your student. We'll discuss this strategy in more depth when we get to the fifth essential component of reading instruction, comprehension. However, think alouds are also helpful to guide students in understanding new vocabulary. When reading aloud, you can stop after reading a sentence containing a new or difficult word and describe to the students how you use context to figure out the word's meaning. You can also discuss an interesting word and encourage students to use it throughout the day. Think alouds do not require any reading to be done by the students. This is a perfect example of how to get students who are currently non-readers to interact meaningfully in literacy. Vocabulary development and reading comprehension are reciprocal. We know that across grades in reading ability, prior knowledge of subject area and key vocabulary results in higher scores on reading comprehension measures. In addition, direct vocabulary instruction has an impressive track record of improving students' background knowledge and comprehension of academic content. Effective vocabulary includes purposeful word selection, carefully explained word meanings, and follow-up, where students think about and use the vocabulary terms. Leading educational consultant, Anita Archer, suggests the following teaching sequence for vocabulary instruction. Step 1, introduce the word's pronunciation. Step 2, introduce the word's meaning. Step 3, illustrate the word with examples and non-examples when helpful. And step 4, check students' understanding. One strategy to support student vocabulary understanding is simplifying text. Rewordify is not an instructional strategy, but it is a fabulous scaffold. You may go to the website, rewordify.com, and copy and paste any text into the yellow box. Press Rewordify text, and the text will be converted to a lower text level. For example, our original sentence might be, consider the use of your story-related objects to pre-teach vocabulary so students can explore the objects through touch to create background knowledge. When you put the word consider into Rewordify, you would get the simplified words, think about. You can see that change on this slide. As you can tell, it is at a lower text level. Also, the highlighted words on the website can be clicked on for students who require additional vocabulary supports. If this text is still too difficult, you can copy and paste this version into Rewordify and get an additional scaffolded text. This is an excellent scaffold that will allow students to independently access the same text as their peers. Feature function class instruction is another great way to begin to introduce your students to the vocabulary for more common words around them. Using pictures, toys, or objects available in a student's environment, you can have your students start by matching identical pictures or objects and work up to receptive and, if possible, expressive identification of pictures, and then begin to ask students to sort or identify pictures by category. We typically break these categories into feature, function, and class. Feature would be grouping by common features or characteristics. For example, you might show a student various foods and have them group them or identify the ones that are cold. Function would be grouping by what they do or what you can do with them. For example, you might have a student group pictures by things you can write on versus things you can write with. Finally, class would be grouping by type. For example, grouping pets together or shapes together. Comprehension is the fifth component of reading instruction, but it is also the end goal of reading. Oral language or spoken language is a key component of comprehension skills. After all, our end goal requires children to decode the words on the page and turn them into spoken language, either out loud or in their head. Then they need to comprehend or understand and interpret that spoken language to make meaning. By focusing on oral language skills, such as practicing the skills of speaking to be understood and listening to understand, you can help improve your students' reading comprehension skills. Before we get into some useful strategies to teach comprehension skills, we want you to keep in mind that listening comprehension and reading comprehension are two different skills. Reading is something that a student does on their own, while listening is something that happens to them. This is important to remember when considering IEP goals. As you can see here, these goals are measuring listening comprehension. When an IEP team members mean for them to be measuring reading comprehension. Take a look at how these goals have been changed to now measure reading comprehension. It is completely appropriate to have listening comprehension goals on a student's IEP if there is a need, as long as the intention is to address listening comprehension and not reading comprehension. Here's an example of an activity that can be used for students who are nonverbal, have limited verbal abilities, or who are emergent readers. In this activity, the parent or teacher presents a short sentence or phrase using vocabulary that is known to the student. The parent or teacher presents a field of 3 picture choices to include 1 correct answer choice and 2 non-answer choices. The student reads the sentence independently and then identifies which picture matches the sentence. You can see here that the teacher used pictures that have girls and tables in them to ensure the student is truly demonstrating comprehension of the sentence rather than just matching the picture that has one of the words in it. You can also check comprehension of the same group of students by giving them a written direction. This is a great way to build not only reading comprehension, but also check for a student's ability to understand that print has meaning and build independence in completing a task. For example, present the students with the sentence, "Turn off the lights." The student should independently read the word and then get up and turn off the lights. When creating sentences that involve themes or ideas that students are unfamiliar with, you should consider using real-life examples to show comprehension. For example, the ball is in the cup. You could use the physical objects to show this, or you could use pictures. As mentioned when discussing vocabulary, recent research suggests that teaching students with intellectual disabilities strategies to monitor their own comprehension can be helpful. One way to achieve this is to conduct frequent think-alouds when reading aloud to the student. During think-alouds, the teacher or parent stops reading at certain points to explain their own thinking and how they are figuring out what is going on or how they are responding to the story. For example, during a fiction read aloud, parents or teachers might stop to make a prediction about what might happen next. They would be explicit in talking about what was noticed in the story that has caused them to make the prediction. Similarly, for students who have difficulty with making inferences, parents or teachers can stop at predetermined points in the text, draw students' attention to certain clues, such as a character's described expression or behavior, and specifically explain how such clues can help tell us about the characters. Students can be asked to actively participate during think-alouds as well. For example, you might ask them, what kind of face might someone make if he or she is up to something sneaky? The students could then be encouraged to make a sneaky face. And then you could bring their attention to where the text refers to a sly smile or shifty eyes. Thank you for joining us for our introduction to the science of reading for students who access an adapted curriculum. Here are the references from today's training.